to the next slide, we did want to acknowledge again the Annie E. Casey support for our work. The National Council wishes to acknowledge that this presentation is made possible by a grant from Annie E. Casey, but that points of view or opinions expressed are those of the faculty and presentation team and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the Annie E. Casey Foundation or the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Thank you, Adriana. The next slide. So before we get into details about San Diego and learning from Tabatha about the experiences and efforts underway in San Diego County to transform probation, we want to learn a little bit about you as participants. So if you would take a moment to help us with a couple of polls. And we'll be moving to, the first poll is going to be asking you about your organizational affiliation. And at this time, please go to your cell phones if they're available or your laptop and go to the website slido.com. So slido.com, or you can use the QR code. And then when it comes up on your screen, on your laptop or your cell phone, put in the number 1176345. And this is a relevant number for all of the polls that we'll have in the next several minutes. And if you would just complete the poll that asks about your role or position and select the answer that fits you best. Oh, good. We have a great variety of folks in the webinar today, Tabatha. So we have, it's always nice to have a diverse audience for getting our information and resources out to folks. It looks like we have pretty clear division or distribution of folks that are judicial officers, great, probation supervision, excellent, and frontline folks, probation officers, and some court professionals. So, and then others, we have a variety of others. Maybe those of you who put in, identified as other, could you put in chat, are you attorneys? Are you, let's see, treatment providers or community organization folks? Let's see, is anybody putting in anything in the chat on that? Oh, JDI coordinator, excellent. State JDI coordinator, very good. Thank you, Jasmine, and that's good to know. And we have some attorneys, excellent. Thanks, Stacy, for letting us know you're with JDI as well, the JDI state coordinator. Well, the good news is we're happy that all of you are joining us, and we hope that you each will find some helpful information from today's webinar. Okay, so if we would close that poll out, and then we have another poll to ask you about your familiarity with the resource that we'll be talking about, and I mentioned a little bit already, is the publication by the NCJ/FCJ, The Role of the Judge in Transforming Juvenile Probation, a Toolkit for Leadership. And this publication was designed specifically for juvenile court judges, but it's certainly something that is a relevant resource to other professionals like probation folks and attorneys. So let's go to the next poll slide in, or poll in the slido.com app. And if you would pick the answer that best reflects your current familiarity with this publication. And we'll be making a link available to the publication during the webinar too. So if you would pick, let's see, your familiarity. So what does that look like coming up? Adriana, what do we have? Okay. Oh, good. It looks like this is new for several people. So we're so happy to make this introduction to this resource. Some are very familiar. Some are a little familiar. Okay. Good. So we won't be going into the details of the various chapters in the toolkit, but I will talk about give a general gist of what's in the toolkit. But one of the practices that the toolkit covers is creating alternatives to detention and your responses to probation violations. So you'll want to actually spend some time, we hope, after the webinar is over, to actually get into the toolkit and look up both the chapters on alternatives to detention, as well as the other chapters we hope will interest you in. So in today's webinar learning objectives, we want to increase your familiarity with the publication. And we want to help you learn about how one jurisdiction is transforming probation through revising detention criteria and decision tools, and through strengthening connections to community activities for youth and increasing communication between judges and probation staff. And then we also hope that you'll be learning strategies for addressing challenges to probation transformation and and getting some ideas about what you can take advantage of as supports. And I did see something in the chat. Okay. So we did have a judge saying that she actually has more familiarity with the toolkit than she had initially indicated in her survey response. Okay. So let us go on. Adriana, if you could move to the next slide. So here's that lovely toolkit. This is what it looks like. There's the link to it, and Adriana will put that in the chat. So basically, a high-level overview of the toolkit is it provides background on the partnership work between the NCJ, FCJ, and NECAC to involve judges in probation transformation. We know that probation has a different framework in a variety of jurisdictions across the country. In some jurisdictions, the court has direct influence over probation and oversees it. In other jurisdictions, the probation may be a state level function that's centralized, and so judges may have a less direct influence. But whatever the situation is in your county or state around probation administration, judges do have an influence on probation practice. And we speak to that in the toolkit. The toolkit focuses on 5 practice areas for reform that we feel judges have great influence on. And the toolkit addresses the whys, whats, and hows to bring about reform in these practice areas. And we also in the toolkit really speak to judges about your special role in your community as leaders and conveners to promote change in the 5 practice areas. So let's move on to what the practice areas are. They concern using individualized goal-oriented case planning. They concern the incentives and rewards, minimizing conditions of probation, alternatives to confinement in response to violations and probation as a disposition for youth involved in serious delinquency, and that the practice of diversion is most appropriate for all other youth. Okay, so if you're already familiar with the toolkit, we hope that you'll find this webinar a nice refresher. And also for those of you that are new to hearing about the toolkit and some of these areas of reform, we hope that it will be new information for you to hear the details from Tabatha about what they've undertaken in San Diego County. And while the focus of today's session is on alternatives to confinement as responses to violations, you'll hear Tabatha talking about the other practice areas that relate, that San Diego has also taken steps to change regarding conditions of probation and using probation as a disposition for youth with serious offenses. So let's, if we can have the next slide. Okay, so in terms of the toolkit, here's what you can find there. And the toolkit sets forth specific descriptions of the practice, what the recommended practice is in each of the 5 areas, and is a great resource for the research or reasons for implementing the practice. Oftentimes you'll find as a judge or a a probation administrator, maybe the prosecutor or members of the public are saying, why are you making this change? Is it really safe for the community to have youth on probation who have serious offenses? Or is it really safe to have only minimal conditions for probation and in the probation orders? And we have great resources on research to answer those questions and enable you to be able to speak directly and with confidence to people who ask about why you're making the changes, what's the support, the key elements of the practice change, and how the practice change can help promote race equity, the role of using data to support that practice change. And Tabatha has some great data from San Diego County that she'll be sharing around implementing alternatives to detention. And the toolkit also addresses the fact that you will get challenges to implementing the recommended practice or your encounter challenges, and what ways to address those challenges. And finally, the toolkit does address how judges can support practice change both on the bench and off the bench in your work with community stakeholders and so forth. Thank you, Adriana. So today's focus of the webinar is Alternative Detention as Responses to Probation Violations. I did want to give a little background on leading up to today's webinar, this whole webinar series. And that is in 2021, when we created the toolkit, it was based on some work that had been done prior to the toolkit. And that was the National Council had enacted a resolution to make probation practice be more connected to adolescent development and the research on what works. And also the toolkit was informed by surveys with judges and probation professionals and judicial advisory groups on what would be most helpful to judges when it came to a resource to support probation transformation. And so we came up with the toolkit, The Role of the Judge in Transforming Juvenile Probation, a Toolkit for Leadership. And as the title suggests, we firmly believe that judges play a leadership role in helping bring about probation transformation and to make probation practices really in line with what we know is effective in working with youth. So then also in thinking about and having created the toolkit, we also realized that judges might and other probation officials might need a little extra support in working through some of the practices recommended, especially ones that might be challenging. And so we came up with a webinar series for this summer to address 3 practice areas that we thought might be especially challenging, and that probation folks and judges would like some additional tips and strategies from jurisdictions that have really undertaken work in the practice areas. So we had a June webinar on minimizing conditions of probation and changing probation culture. And that webinar is recorded and available for those of you who may not have had the chance to participate in it. Or if you did, but wanted to review it again, we have the link that's available. And then today's webinar, which is on alternatives to detention. And then we'll have our August webinar on using probation as a disposition for youth with serious offenses. And as I mentioned, you'll be seeing that while we have identified the specific topics for these different webinars, we do see that the practice areas and practices relate to one another. Okay, so if I could have the previous slide, Adriana, on the focus of today's webinar. So we know that denying young people their freedom puts a formidable barrier between a young person and a healthy life of opportunity, because detention disrupts family, work, and community ties and stymies normal adolescent development. Young people in institutions lose the opportunity to participate in many important rites of passage associated with adolescence. And we know that well-designed community-based programs that are associated with probation, for example, are more likely than institutional confinement to facilitate healthy development and reduce recidivism. And today's webinar is focused on detention. And when we think about detention, as a response to probation violations, I think you mostly view it as something that is shorter term versus longer term. And that could be a weekend or it could be a couple weeks, rather than what is sort of implied in this, with this quote here from the toolkit, is longer term institutional confinement could be several weeks or several months. But whether it's short term detention or longer term institutional confinement, we know that research tells us that confinement and detention has deleterious short-term and long-term consequences for youth. It's disruptive in a variety of ways, and it also can aggravate underlying mental health issues that could be related to trauma as well. And another piece of the research that we have drawn on to inform the toolkit and our recommended practice concerns some of the practices that lead to tremendous disparity. And one area that we know of is that it relates to confinement and detention. And we know that youth of color are more likely to be placed in detention than their white peers. And this means that the various harms and disruptions caused by detention fall disproportionately on youth of color, and disparities associated with this practice compound disparities that youth of color experience at other decision points with the juvenile justice system and law enforcement that precede detention. So when we reform practices around the use of detention and creating alternatives, juvenile justice practitioners can really help to make youth experiences and outcomes with the justice system more fair, more equitable, and more positive in the short run and the long run. So again, before we get into hearing from Tabatha about alternatives to detention in place in San Diego, we wanted to hear from you. So let's go again to the Slido.com. And if you could take a moment to type in on your cell phone app an example of an alternative to detention as a response to probation violation that you are using in your jurisdiction. Electronic monitoring, GPS, okay. Other ideas, other practices. Home supervision. And STAP homes. Could someone, whoever wrote in STAP homes, also add what STAP refers to? Community youth coaches, excellent. Referrals to services, non-secure residential placement, nice. Community service hours, okay. Very good. Well, this is giving us some good ideas about the range of alternatives that are already in place that you have implemented, and this is very encouraging. And we hope that you get some new ideas from what Tabatha will be sharing about San Diego. Okay, at this point, let's shift over. Adriana, if you could take us to the next slide. And now I'm so happy to turn the webinar over to Tabatha Wilburn, so you can hear from her directly about probation transformation that's underway in San Diego County. And I'll let Tabatha share with you her more about her position, and Tabatha that gives her this great opportunity to provide some leadership and support for her probation colleagues there, the frontline folks and administration on bringing about some really pretty exciting changes in probation practice. So Tabatha, thank you so much for joining us today, and take it away.
Hi, good morning, everyone. As she said, I'm Tabatha Wilburn. I am a deputy chief with the County of San Diego, our probation department. I want to thank you, Martha. Thank you, Adriana, for your technical support. And thank you all for attending the webinar, as well as a big thank you to the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. What I'm going to talk to you today about is the juvenile probation transformation. And what you'll see is I'll kind of go through a history of things so you can see how we landed where we are. I know Martha kind of gave a disclaimer earlier saying that it started kind of in 2012. You can go to the next slide, please, Adriana. We started with our crossover youth practices. I know we're in 2022 now, so it was a gradual process, as you all know. Change sometimes is okay when it goes a little slower because we have to get the buy-in, but it did start off with our crossover youth motto. As you know, San Diego County has had a rich history of embarking on transformation efforts. And this is our timeline of when we actually started our timeline of a past and current county collaborations with the Center of Juvenile Justice Reform, the CJJR at Georgetown. In 2012, the County of San Diego began the collaboration with the Center of Juvenile Justice Reform in Georgetown with the crossover youth model. We did that then, and the CYPM had provided mechanisms for agencies to strengthen their organizational structure and enhance our efforts for the cross-system collaboration, implementing more practices that directly affected the outcome for crossover youth and their families and communities. I would say that was the beginning of our change because we had to collaborate with child welfare services, dependency, delinquency, and those partnerships had to be gathered together. And then also we had to have the buy-in from the court. We didn't have this because that's how we created our dual jurisdiction calendar. So once we got the buy-in from them, we started seeing that collaboration actually is a good thing. So we moved on with that. I know sometimes it's difficult because everybody has their own role and their own goal, but the actual goal is for the youth. So once we have that in mind, we're able to move forward. Then in 2015, we had the Youth in Custody Certificate Program. We had our TRUE unit where we kind of focused more on those youth with mental health, and we target those goals for those youth that were in custody. And then in 2017, we all know we moved to the Youth in Custody practice model. That was big for everyone. And then in 2019, we did the Transforming Juvenile Probation System Improvement Plan. Now, our county has continued to collaborate in reform efforts and began implementing the youth. These programs, the transforming, when we did with our Annie Casey, we had a big transformation series where we had all our collaborative partners, the courts, the district attorneys, public defenders, other partners. I believe we had children initiatives involved in this as well. And all these parties, our CBOs, all came on board and to listen to what was the next plan and what we needed them to do in order to assist us in moving forward to make some of these transitions. Next slide, please, Adriana. And the urgency for change. Over the years, the focus for probation has, we've been compliance-based. We recognize that you wanted the kids to get you 20 hours of community service and different things like that. We all had that. So it was a gradual change as we've seen it continue to see, because legislation kind of directs which direction we will go. We start seeing change in legislation, which had to be a reflection of what we had to do. So in California in particular, there's been a strong criticism about, not collaborating, but there has been a lot of collaboration. I can say here at San Diego County, and I'm sure in all of your counties too, that we've already changed that perspective on making sure we collaborate with our partners. I know with us, we've had from when I go back from 2012 to now, we've had a series of our presiding judges from Judge Tronacosta, Judge Bashant, Judge Cayeti, and now we have Judge Espana, who's taking that torch and running with it as well as her assistant presiding as well. We have Talisha Martin too, who's also that judge, they're working together with us to help us move forward with some of these changes that we're trying to make sure that we can implement. We recognize we can't do without the court. Next slide, please. What is probation transformation? Well, as you saw, that it's been a gradual thing. Let's put it that way. But what we had to do first was we had to start working on our heart set, our mindset, our skill set, and our tool set. Those are all Blue Courage pillars that we had to utilize. So when we want to implement things, we also have to get our staff on board with these are how the direction that we're going. And so a lot of things had to be implemented with the Blue Courage, because we look at a heart set. If your heart set is feeling and it's ignited and it creates a burning passion to serve. And we have a lot of people who have that burning passion to serve. And we have a lot of clients who can utilize that assistance and need somebody with that passion. But when your heart is right, then you can get the mind right. That's when the mind is open for that change. So we want to make sure that we address the heart set first before we move to the mindset. And then once we had the mindset, that's when we started to implement practices embracing new ways of doing things by creating the skill set, which was needed for our staff. And then, of course, there's the tool set, seeking out the right tools of learning for the tools. And that's why we reached out to so many people from Georgetown, Annie Casey, and then relied more on our SMEs too, who were quite familiar, because we do have probation staff who are very experienced and recognize things that need to be done as well. Can we move to the next slide, please, Adriana? This is just another way for us to kind of transform. We see where we're out and engaging, and then we sometimes go to elementary schools too, so we can engage in these youth as well, because it starts here. Next slide, please. Our original collaboration was with Georgetown, and as you see, this is where we have all our partners from Public Safety Group, Probation, Public Defender's Office. So we were just trying to show that we had that clear collaboration with these partners in order to get to where we are today. Next slide. Now here are our capstone goals. We used a picture of jumping off the cliff because some people felt like that's what was happening, because we had to make these moves, and a lot of times you have a little resistance to change. So what we had to do first was create our mission and core statements and development. We had to reduce the number of probation violations for our medium and low risk youth. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then we had to increase the access to our achievement centers, and we had to develop and implement juvenile justice disposition matrix. Next slide, please. We also had to do a decrease the use of intense supervision practices, expand referrals to community-based and alternatives to detention, training on national best practices, and implement strength-based plans to use the San Diego County Broad SDRC2. Here we talk about the San Diego justice system, the core beliefs, what the scientific research has proven, juvenile justice system approaches. There are just so many things that you see here that are listed. Utilizing diversion, programming is important for youth services. These are things that have been in place, but then have been more enhanced since we've started working on trying to move forward and change our alternatives to detention, and not focus on more punitive, but give them other ways in order to address some of the behavior issues that we've known to be, sometimes might just be general teenage behavior. I know a lot of us were teenagers. Some of us won't tell our past, but I'm sure we're not always walking around with a halo on our head, and we don't think we warrant probation. So some of these kids should be afforded that same opportunity and not necessarily have to be placed on formal probation. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, we had to create our mission and vision. I mean, you have to let people know where you're going and what you expect to see in order to get what the ultimate goal is. So therefore, we had to update and create our new mission and vision statements for our juvenile, we call it the Youth Development and Community Support Services, and that's for our youth here in San Diego. Next slide. And this is what the goal and the mission and vision that we had established for ourselves. a fair and equitable system to support for youth and families involved in the juvenile system that value the youth's individual needs and provides access to meaningful and relevant opportunities for success. I think we all share that vision here on this call. We definitely want to make sure that things are equitable, and we want to make sure that the kids are given opportunities to be successful. Next slide, Adriana. Our core values. These are core values that everyone on this call, on this webinar, I'm sure share, with the respect, equity, commitment, compassion, motivation, positivity, innovation, and collaboration. All these things have to happen. This is not a one-man show. We recognize that we have to engage and collaborate with partners, receive training from other people that on things that are innovative, and have a commitment to those changes too, in order for us to be successful and for the youth to be successful. Here's our field services transformation areas. And this is where you may have questions where it's to reduce the number of probation violations. Well, I will say that this was not an easy transition to start to get the mindset to change in this area. When you're used to violating youth for like not accomplishing, I'll give an example of some kids may be continued or violated because of the fact of if your grades, you have all Fs, you're not going to school, you're failing, and behavior at home is not the same, not appropriate. So what we had to do was had to look and do a deeper dive and to see what is causing all these things. And one of the issues is that we had to find other ways and get other services in place to help those youth instead of just violating them, see what we can give them the tools that they needed to move forward and to be successful rather than to do a violation. I mean, we may say, we know Fs are not good grades, but then that kid now is getting a couple of Ds and a few Cs. So there was no need to maybe continue him on or to continue to violate him and continue him on probation or violate him on probation because he was making progress. We can actually compliment him on the achievements that he's made and then still help him work to progress through so he can still get better and be more successful. Next. Here we had to increase the access to achievement centers. So rather than tell that if a kid was having issues out in the community, we started, they opened up achievement centers. Achievement centers are in 3 regions for us. We have our Central, our North County, and our East County. And what this has allowed is they've had like tutorial services, they've had culinary classes for these youth. It's kind of like an after school program for these youth to go to. And a lot of them get there and they really love going there because they get so many things out of it. So we've used that as like a quick alternative to detaining youth. When they get referred to the achievement centers, they're there, they can be there from a minimum to 20 to 45 days, and then they can start a reset. We found that the kids to go to the achievement center oftentimes want to continue because it's a place for them to go. They're getting the support that they need. They actually feed them meals there also. So there are a lot of issues that are being addressed there that are preventing us from having to put youth in custody unnecessarily. Next slide, please. One of the things that we've also developed here in San Diego County is called our disposition recommendation matrix. We call it the DISPO matrix. This matrix has made it possible for us to address some of our EDI issues, equity, diversity, and inclusion. When you look at this, you don't know what color the youth is, you just look at what the criteria are, and then you look at that, and that's determination of what this youth will get as far as, do you go home? Do you get a small custodial sanction, or do we divert you completely and maybe give you a 725A or something of that nature? This has allowed us to show that there are different ways to deal with our youth other than detention, but this is one of the detention formats that we use should we have to detain them. We do have a level where you can deviate from that, but our deviation level is maybe about less than 5%. And the majority of the time when our staff are deviating, they may say like, I think this youth should get a probation to the court instead of this, or I think this youth may end up with a 725A. It's usually a deviate down more than it is a deviate up. Next slide. Decreased our use of intensive supervision practices. Now, this one was major for us, especially if we had youth that were high-risk youth. I guess the term used to be, if you go searching for something, you'll definitely find it. When we used to do more fourth waiver searches and seeing the youth more than the times that we originally allocated. So we had to make some adjustments, and high-risk youth was seen twice a month, and fourth waivers were as necessary. We also changed our recommendations with this. Not everybody gets a fourth waiver. It has to have a nexus to it. The court has been very clear on that. I know we have Judge Espana on here, and she'll know that if it's not a nexus, the court is not going to order it. So we make sure that there's a need to have a fourth waiver search. And all cases didn't, but it used to be like a one-size-fit-all. Because you were on probation, there was fourth waiver added, but that has not been the practice for quite some time now. And having that has allowed us to supervise kids appropriately on the level that they are. If they're high risk, they will be seen twice a month, but it's just done in a different way where it's just not so intense as it used to be at one time before, which also created more violations.
But if I could just chime in here, I think that's a great example and tie in with our first webinar, which is on minimizing probation conditions. So it just seems like you've just heard some tremendous reassurance from Tabatha that those of you who are like feel really connected to, oh, we've got to have a probation condition about waiving search, the protections against search and seizure, that Tabatha is letting us know in San Diego County, they were able to look at that condition as one that should only be imposed based on the use offense as needed. Isn't that right, Tabatha? But it's not a standard condition that is imposed on everybody.
Correct. I mean, we recognize that there were some offenses that didn't warrant a fourth waiver, but by us making it standard, everybody has one. So that was the increasing in our violations because we were giving more access. And sometimes there was minimal things that the officer may find, but it's just the fact that you had that as an option. It just increased. So not having it has caused a decrease in that. I'm sorry, I kind of lost my place here. Next slide, please. So we expanded our referrals to our community-based alternatives to detention. It may not having alternatives to that, like we have what we call ATD here, that we will screen the case with them, and if they're able to hold the kid there, sometimes some families needed timeouts from each other, and alternatives to detentions allowed that. And then the youth would be reignited with his family with services in place. That kind of mitigated having more probation violations with youth in custody, and also it prevented our kids from being placed in custody. And as you see, the services included risk assessment, intensive case management, case advocacy, and then they had drug and alcohol prevention, academic enhancement, community service opportunities, and home and school visitations. Having all those things in place, I know all of you are engaged in these services with these youth, but you all know that sometimes people don't want to ask for help. And sometimes you can do an assessment and kindly say, maybe this might help you out a little bit if you were given these services. And once they're given them, you'd be amazed at just how that has changed their perspective on things. And then they look for more things that might be beneficial to not only the youth, but the entire family. Next.
And on that note, Tabatha, was it the case that you already had, San Diego County already had a lot of these services in place, or did some of them actually get developed in order to help the the team achieve that goal?
Well, we've had quite a bit of services in place. I mean, we've had our choice program. We've had what we call alternatives to detention. We've recently got some programs with like those with lived experiences over a couple of years, like our resilience programs. We have that. And then the achievement centers are fairly new, maybe a couple of years that we've had those to see if those would assist our youth from being able to go into custody. And we still have the same things that other counties mentioned on here, as far as there's still the home supervision option as an alternative as well. But we just try to make sure that they get the services they need after we've done an assessment on them.
And it seems like what you're connecting youth to really help with skill building, and connections. So, which is different from if you've got home supervision or GPS or electronic monitoring. Those impose restraints on kids or constraints, but they don't necessarily add to the youth's problem-solving skills or their pro-social activities. And so really it's this, I think what's exciting and inspiring about San Diego is that the active work that probation officers are doing to really contribute to the youth's skill building activities and time. And that is what changes behavior, rather than putting constraints on them to not do certain things, is helping them engage in behavior that's desirable.
Correct. And I will say now that, we do have a new chief that has come here. We've created a new case plan. It's called a client action plan. We've always done case planning in probation. I know people seem to think probation didn't do case planning, but we've always had that as a part of our job. But this CAP, we call it the CAP, our case plan is designed more for where it has SMART goals, and then we turn around and we put tasks inside the goals for the kids to have to do. And then the kid chooses a goal also, because we feel like if we empower them to pick one of their goals, that maybe they'll work harder at it and get things done. And it's an evolving document that once you complete one, we add another thing in. And it has so many other people involved too with this. We might have the youth counselor, the parent. We've had a pastor attend just so we can make sure that the youth is back on track. So we're trying to make sure that the transformation and to keep this youth out of custody as an alternative, that we have everyone engaged in that. And so in doing that, we do see that we're starting to see a bit more changes than we've seen before. So we've done our training on our national best practices. Next goal, please. Next slide, please. Is Adriana still there? Okay. And let's see, the detention admission has decreased dramatically since 2018. We know that the pandemic has definitely been a contributor, but it's not the main contributor. We have definitely worked hard to make these changes, but there has been a decrease in detention admissions, and it's a variety of things. There's our diversion programs. The DA is now taking on one. We previously had one. The court, when we have kids that do go to the court is a major part in maybe ordering a kid to probation to the court, granting the DJ, doing the 725A or the 654.2 that they're granted. So this allowed us to have a decrease in our detention admissions. So any questions on that? No? Okay, next slide. We had to align with our CAPSTONE goals. Detention admissions based on technical violations have decreased dramatically, as you see again, which is showing technical violations. We're not oblivious to the fact, as I mentioned before, that the pandemic may have played some part in that, but our numbers are still fairly decent despite the pandemic happening. The work is starting to show. Next slide. And this is still, the timeline that we're showing here, decrease across multiple system points. And next. Please, thank you. And then, you know, we had to show our average length of stay on probation increased substantially from 2020 to 21. And then we're still working on these statistic information. As we've mentioned in the past, that sometimes probation is, I don't want to say we're held accountable in a way as far as if we detain certain youth of color, but we're trying to work with our law enforcement partners in the community, because when they bring them and they're charged with certain things, probation have certain obligations. So we're trying to work with them to see that we can make sure that the right client is being brought to us, because if you're bringing us the wrong client and they're charged with these things, then we have to do our job. But we're trying to work to alleviate this issue, because we are seeing there's still some disparities going on, but we know now we're doing our work inside, so now we need to go outside to other agencies.
And Tabatha, could you address what is, in terms of the number of months, the average length of stay, that average length of probation for youth these days?
Well, I know that we've already started implementing where we put kids on for, everybody gets a 6-month review. So it's ranging from maybe 9 months to the 12-month range. Sometimes they have to be continued a little longer, but we have started getting closer to those who actually complete their goals and are ready to move forward in 6 months. But as I said, this has just been initiated. It hasn't been in effect too long, so you do have a longer stay for 9 to 12 months. And then they usually are done and completed their probationary period with us.
And that completing probation is triggered by them completing their goals and their case plan. Is that primarily what guides that decision?
Right, it's more case plan focused, more than compliance based. It's case plan focused, because we want to make sure that we give them the tools that they need in order to go out in the community and not to come back to us again. And that's the sole goal. And sometimes you might not get everything completed, but they'll have tasks within those goals that they were given. If they complete some of those tasks, and we know they're on the right path, and then we like to continue with some services out. There are other programs that we have that you don't have to be on probation to receive, and that they can continue through those services to make that warm handoff continue. So. Oh,
that's great. That's great, because I think that some communities do worry that kids won't get services unless they are on probation. So that should not be a reason to continue somebody on probation, right? Is they'll still, and it sounds like in your community, you have a way to still connect kids to services.
Correct, and I see that Judge Chandler, I believe, had in here that regarding the increased length of probation, is it also attributed to the availability of services? Are the service providers overloaded? No, I think for us, I actually feel that we're super fortunate because we have a myriad of services. I mean, we do have our choice program, we have our achievement centers, we have the ATD, we have resilience. They just bought a new service on Shots Fired. So we have CAT for other people. So we have so many services that there's a kid that's gonna be able to fit one of those services. And one thing I can say about our department as well is that we also have regional clinicians. So we have those regional clinicians in each region, and those clinicians are sometimes given referrals, and then they can tell us too, okay, based on this, I mean, maybe this youth can do some one-on-one with me, maybe we can send him here. So it's not for a lack of services. I think we have to make sure we monitor to make sure, okay, we don't want to put too much on the youth because the services are not overloaded, not here. So thank you for that question.
And Tabatha, Scott actually had a couple of comments about some of the data. He indicated the drop in detentions exceeds the drop in referrals, which suggests that your deliberate efforts are working, and the drops clearly started before COVID. And then Scott with Annie Casey, and he is able to give us also the national perspective because he works with probation all across the country. And Scott noted in his chat as well that in the national sites, they're tending to see long lengths of stay on probation that well exceed a year. so that standard probation across the country is much longer than what you're talking about as practice in San Diego.
Well, thank you for that, Scott. Yes. Well, I know for us, if you're looking at nationally, I do know that we do have this one range of the 9 to 12 months, but I do recognize that obviously there's some kids who have offenses that are going to warrant a longer period of time. And so they average out for those who are on for lesser time. So,
and that's probably relevant and important to note when you start using probation as a disposition for use with serious offenses, and that's the recommended practice, that they will take longer to work with and connect to services and build up the different skills that they need to be on their healthy development trajectory, versus the kids who are low risk or moderate risk for reoffending. They don't need a lot of help. They don't, right? So they don't need to have a lot of time with probation, and they don't need a bunch of probation conditions either. So it makes sense.
Right, but when you average it out, because pretty soon we'll be getting secure track youth, and when you get those, then that time is going to definitely make our average time look a little different. Next slide, please. What should we start doing? You know, that's what we're doing already. Practice that are directly related to our vision and goals. We're practicing and anticipate may yield better results. What should we stop doing? What we've stopped doing really is practices that are either not working or helping to achieve our goals, and practices that impede on progress and are not sustainable and practical. I know my chief always says to us, what does the data say? You know, so but the data is, you can say this, that's what you feel, but if our data doesn't say it, it's not really happening. So, next slide, please. You can go to the next one on that. That's just one we added in. And so out of this, we had, in order to make sure that we're still enhancing our services and making sure that we're working to get our clients off probation, reduce alternatives to detention, we had our 5 navigation groups that we got for our capstone projects. That was case planning, community partnership, race, equity, and inclusion, incentives and interventions and operations. Those groups are still working and still trying to find ways to enhance what we are currently doing, submitting ways to make our clients feel that they can rely on probation, confide in us, talk to us, so we can give them the services, so that our next steps are not trying to confine you, that our next steps are trying to ensure that they are receiving the services. We did get some of this information out of our transformation groups that we got when Annie Casey came out and met with our whole team. So next slide. I know we're on time. And that's just a quote from Arthur Ashe, who I feel was a remarkable man. And I think the last one, it's quite clear. You may never know what results come of your action, but do nothing, there will be no result. So that's kind of how we're thinking here. I hope somebody got something out of this.
Oh my goodness, I should think so. In fact, we were asked if we would share the PowerPoint slide, because I think that the presentation is so rich with so many specific activities that San Diego pursued and implemented. And I think that's really an important message that you offer, is that a variety of strategies work together. It's not just one, but several different streams of work can take place at the same time, or build on one another to actually achieve the bigger data obvious change, so that you can look at, well, how is detention being used? And especially in responses to probation violations. So I love that you laid everything out so beautifully in the several goals that you set forth, all related to your probation transformation. And then you very systematically described what for each goal, what were the key steps that you took, what people needed to do, and the focus of the work. And so it seems like a lot of what actually had to take place started with your initial notions of what's our mission, our vision. And I love that the language you used about the heart set, the mindset, the skill set, and the tool set. I bet that's resonating with people, of lining all of these things up. It's like what you're thinking about is what your work is as probation professionals working with youth and bringing about behavior change. And then what do you need to take that a realization of what your work is to make it really have that outcomes that you want. And so that concerns the tools and the skill set that probation folks need. And so that's about organizational culture. And that seems like it's a very important starting point then, and sets a foundation for then the actual practice changes, the ideas about probation conditions, the ideas about being committed to connecting youth to services in response to when they're not doing well, rather than putting them in detention when they're not doing well. So I think there's probably a lot of interest in having the PowerPoint presentation slides, because of the nice way that you laid out the very specific things that probation undertook in San Diego to bring about the changes we see reflected in the data. And then also to move forward to continue with the work. The work's not done. I know that you mentioned there was still concerns about perhaps a disproportionality with youth of color, and you're still working on that. I think there's a lot of energy still as part of your project to keep connecting youth to the community, to keep learning about new resources in the community, or encouraging new resources to work with youth to continue to think in terms of once a youth is off of probation, they still will benefit from being connected to the community and services and whatnot. I'm happy to turn it over. We have a few minutes to hear from the participants about further questions that y'all have on anything that Tabatha shared about the San Diego's experience. I know that they got a lot of help by going through the Georgetown University programs, certificate programs, and they also received training and technical assistance from Annie E. Casey. I know that Annie E. Casey is available to provide training and technical assistance. If you're not familiar with Annie E. Casey's website, JDI Connect, Google that, join the JDI community. There's a lot of wonderful exchange of resources and experiences among everyone who subscribes to the JDI Connect. And then the National Council, we have our resources. You mentioned the toolkit, but if you go online to ncjfcj.com, ncjfcj.org, you can see the variety of resources that we have for probation support and juvenile justice reform. So are there any questions that people want to put in the chat? Let's see. And again, Adriana put in the access to juvenile probation, our website information and resources. That's in the chat. We get a comment from Jasmine thanking you, Tabatha, for the great presentation and how informative it was. I really liked what Tabatha had to say about not only the role of organizational change, cultural change, but collaboration. That is a theme to transformational work, isn't it? Is hearing about how much San Diego County probation folks really reached out to a lot of colleagues and stakeholders and worked with the judges and community folks on collaboration. And that was an early piece of the work and ongoing. And that is something that the toolkit talks about as an important strategy for doing any transformation in any of the practice areas. Is you can't do it alone. As Tabatha mentioned, probation folks can't do a probation transformation alone. The support from the stakeholders and judges is really important. Let's see. So actually, as people are thinking either about questions for Tabatha or about what you've reflected on as a result of listening to today's session, if you could add your ideas or strategies to the slido.com page that we have up, we'd love to see what you've been thinking about as a result of what you've heard. Thinking outside the box for probation, yes. Teaming with community partners to implement change, lovely. Those are lovely ideas. Other ideas that people have. Don't be shy.
The key is too, as you mentioned before, Martha, that having judges that are on board, it makes all the difference as well, because when we're trying to affect change, if we want to do something, we have to have the buy-in from the court. And if they're not buying in, then we can't get the implementation on a lot of things. So it's definitely helpful.
Great. And that's where I hope the toolkit as a resource will come in to help judges. I know that Tabatha mentioned the role of research on various practices, recommended practices, what works, what doesn't work. And the toolkit is a great resource to just quickly review some of the highlights of research on adolescent development and what we know works with youth and why. Another thought for an idea or strategy from today's webinar is paying attention to readiness building for system change. So working with your workforce and getting their hearts and their minds aligned, and then giving them the tools and the skills they need. Achievement centers. I loved it when I first learned from Tabatha when we were preparing for today's webinar, what she shared about the achievement centers, and they sound great, don't they? I just thought these are like activities for enrichment for youth after school. And we know that many well-resourced families bring activities to their children or get their children to activities, dance, music, sports, what have you. But there are lots of families in our communities and the families of youth on probation who don't have the time or the resources to connect their kids to these kinds of skill building opportunities. And it seems like the achievement centers are one-stop shops. The kids get to have meals there. They get to engage in skill building, maybe get some additional help with tutoring for school and ideas about future employment, culinary arts. That sounds like so much fun. And San Diego is going to be a great place to bring out some of the talents of the culinary community and having them shared with youth on probation. Let's see, developing matrix for supervision. That was something very concrete that Tabatha shared that I hope people will take a look at, and that are responses to youth behavior using an objective matrix that, as she pointed out, doesn't matter the gender or the color of the youth or what have you, race, ethnicity. These are the behaviors, these are the options to choose from for responses. I also loved what Tabatha said about case plan and goals and having youth choose of the things you could work on for your goals or your tasks, choose. The youth get to choose, and that obviously helps with buy-in. So a lot of great thinking behind the practices that probation has in place, and the thinking that lines up so nicely with what we know about adolescent development. So mindsets, youth change, develop, those are great ideas or keywords to keep in mind. Help, heart sets, community is really important. That got mentioned several times in Tabatha's remarks about the community. Any other thoughts or questions or inspirations people want to add to the word cloud before we wrap up? I know we have as a final slide is the contact information for both Tabatha and me. If you want to get further information, learn a little bit more about a specific practice that Tabatha mentioned, that you can connect through us with us through email. We'd be happy to hear from you and respond. And we see a thank you message from Scott, and a thank you certainly to Tabatha for sharing the San Diego experience. I think it's pretty inspiring. San Diego is a very large community, and on the one hand, that might mean that has more resources than other communities, but it also means that it has more cats to wrangle and herd when it comes to all being on the same page about a vision and mission in probation transformation. And so I hope that everyone feels reassured and inspired that if changes can be made in a community like San Diego, where there are lots of pieces to the puzzle that need to be worked with and connected to, it can happen. And it takes time, but it can happen. And then I think when you get to look at data that suggests that what you're intending to happen is happening, that's encouraging to keep on with your vision and your inspiration. So with that note, I would like to wrap this webinar up. Thank you all very much for your time participating. Thank you so much, Tabatha, for sharing the information about San Diego. And thank you for your great leadership in that community. I just feel very excited. I actually have lived in San Diego in the past and have very warm associations with that community. And I'm really so pleased for you and San Diego that these great things have been happening with probation.
Thank you so much, Martha. Thank you.
And on that, we will conclude our time for today. Thank you, everyone, so much, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.